What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So historically speaking, I don't really split stories, at least not recently I don't. I mean, there was a time that I did, but I've basically kind of just gone to doing, all the whole story arc for the most part. But with Superman, or I guess with Action Comics Revenge, I wanted to split this in half. And the reason why is because the second half of this discussion is not something I'd be able to do if we did the entire thing at once. And we'll get to why, here in a minute. But if you're just catching up, in the first part of Revenge, we had basically run over the idea that General Zod had basically been taken. He'd been freed from the Phantom Zone and had been taken by the Suicide Squad for the purpose of being inducted onto their team. The result is that he basically engineered his own escape, and then he was met with the arrival of Eradicator and Cyborg Superman, who recruited him to their cause. Of course, their cause basically being the defeat of Superman. I mean, it's pretty par for the course. So the idea was to bring Superman down using some of his most notable foes. Now remember, all of this basically stemmed out of Superman Reborn. When Mr. Mxyzptlk had warped reality, one of the things that happened was that in addition to Superman basically being restored to his classic self, we also ended up having Hank Henshaw, his memories restored, meaning that he realized that he was Cyborg Superman. And this is important because what this means is that despite all these individuals being here, Cyborg Superman was the only one who originally knew of the entire history before the New 52. It wasn't until he basically started going around and waking up people like Mongol to their true history that they began to become aware of what it was that was going on. Now, the reason why this is also kind of cool is because this coincides with their intention to attack the Fortress of Solitude. And the reason for this is because the Fortress of Solitude is by definition the last bastion of Krypton. It's all the technology and different resources and so on that Superman's been able to accrue over the course of his career and by various technologies that he had at his disposal when he first landed on Earth, that he was able to basically go through and create the Fortress of Solitude. But this matters because Cyborg Superman and General Zod and others want to get their hands on the technology inside the Fortress of Solitude for a variety of different reasons. Now, these reasons aren't absolute. I mean, they basically range in a multitude of different ways. For example, General Zod wants to recreate Krypton, and the Fortress of Solitude, the technology locked within, will let him do that. With the defeat of Superman, it would allow Blank to basically go through, use his telepathy and telekinesis, and just start his canvas of death as it's described. These are the kind of things that end up popping up with all their grand schemes. So it's really just an amalgamation of personal desires that come together for the purpose of taking down Superman. Now, the other half of this is that in the event when the original Black Vault in the Suicide Squad was destroyed, in the ensuing chaos, Superman lost his eyesight. And so at this moment right now, Superman's effectively blind. Now, again, you can get caught up with a little more of an explanation in the video down in the description, which was part 1, but this is a scenario that Superman has not readily faced before. The idea of losing his eyesight, and the way this is done is actually kind of cool. When it comes to his various abilities that require sight, so his telescopic vision, x-ray vision, so on and so forth, those are gone. With heat vision, he still has that. And the reason is, at least as it's explained, is because heat vision is not a function of eyesight. Heat vision is a function of just channeling energy through his eyes. It's really one of the cool things in order for, Superman to still be somewhat effective. The other half of this is, remember, in the last video, we had talked about how the assault on Superman from his various foes was being broadcast on live television. Now, this is kind of a repeat of history. Remember, back in the original Death of Superman story, when Doomsday had first popped up, he had basically gone through and the fight between himself and Superman was broadcast to the world. And so it's almost like DC is basically kind of going back and learning from that story and correcting things. The reason why I say that is because while members of the superhero community for the most part did what they could, at the end of the day, Doomsday was just too much. The Death of Superman was designed to be a story where Superman was the only guy who could beat Doomsday and sacrificed his life in the process. With this, it's not the same way. We now have the Superman family, Lex Luthor Superman, Chinese Superman, Supergirl, and we have Superwoman. We also have Krypto, the Superdog, which is kind of cool. But we have these various characters who all have the ability to stand toe-to-toe alongside Superman as he faces off against his own other enemies. Something else to point out here, and this is actually a brilliant maneuver, when it comes to DC Rebirth, one of the things that DC's focused on is the cohesiveness of the DC universe, which is to say superheroes crossing over into stories that you wouldn't normally see. In this particular particular story, we don't see Batman, we don't see Green Lantern, the Flash, Wonder Woman, or any of the members of the Justice League. We don't see like Shazam or anything like that. But it's hinted at the idea that Superman should call them in. And that's one of the great things about this, the introduction of the Superman family into this story, is the idea that on the whole, one of the biggest issues that Superman has historically had when it came to his own stories is that it was always just him against the world. No matter how bad things got, it was always Superman somehow musters up the courage to win the fight. And if you're a Superman fan, you absolutely love it. But if you're a person coming into comic books with an eye for practicality, it doesn't make any sense to you. There has to be a point where Superman just can't do it on his own. And that's the cool thing here, is because this brings that question into the equation. Lois Lane asks, shouldn't you call in the Justice League? You're literally blind and you're going against some of your most powerful villains. Superman's response is, maybe we should. But at that moment, the forces of General Zod and everybody basically launch their attack. Superman faces off against them the best they can. But when it comes to the introduction of the members of the Justice League, it's not necessary because the Superman family responds. But it's those little things that make DC Rebirth so cohesive. It's those small things that make the story so unique. Because if this were going to be a story from like the 1990s or the 1980s, well then somehow Superman would get his eyesight by magic, and then somehow he would end up winning the day, and that would be it. And it would take away from the gravity of the situation. Because with the Superman family coming in, we as the reader look at this and we're like, well then Superman can't do it on his own. If Superman were to fight them by himself, he would probably die. The Super family stepping in and helping him out shows the gravity of that situation, and that's why it's so cool. Now the other half of this is Lois Lane and Jonathan Kent. Remember, they're residing within the Fortress of Solitude. They're just kind of trying to keep hidden as best they can. I mean, they're out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, even if they were to get out of the Fortress of Solitude, they're still in the middle of the Arctic. So I mean, they can't just like jump on a plane and fly away. And even if they tried, the Superman Legion of Doom, so to speak, they would destroy Lois Lane and Jonathan. And so what ends up happening here is it basically has Superman and the Superman family fighting against these various individuals. But the cool thing about this, and notice this, General Zod is the one who leads the conflict. By no definition is General Zod the leader of the group, but General Zod is a much better tactician than Hank Henshaw, Cyborg Superman. And so what he ends up doing is he actually reaches out to the character of Blank, this super powerful telepath and telekinetic, and simply says, link my mind to everybody else's. I've seen how Superman fights. I know what he's capable of. I know how to defeat him and the other members of the Superman family, but we have to do it in a way that works effectively. And so each member is paired off strategically with those individuals they're best suited to fight against. Going through this massive battle, I mean, you have Eradicator facing off against Superwoman. Eradicator is a being of energy. Superwoman is a being of energy. You know, you have Blank going against Chinese Superman, going against Kenan Kong. And it's kind of these cool little moments because Kenan's never faced Blank. He doesn't know who he is. Blank, as an older guy, just kind of pawns it off of, oh, hey, you know, I couldn't survive one of your punches. Don't hit me. Only for, you know, Kenan to basically be taken by surprise with Blank's telepathy and telekinesis. But with Supergirl, it's an interesting situation because remember, when it came to the character of Kara Zor-El, back before Crisis on Infinite Earths, she was more powerful than Superman was. She was stronger, she was faster, she was more capable. There wasn't necessarily a definitive answer given to that, at least not that I'm aware. And the declaration of her being more powerful than Superman really came by way of Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was that 12-issue story, and it wasn't until, you know, the final conflict against the Anti-Monitor that we actually learned that when she basically died. But in the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths landscape, while she didn't appear for some 20 years, or I guess maybe even 10 years after the event took place, when she came back, it was still this idea that she could be more powerful than Superman was. Now, the pre-Crisis Supergirl is a thing we haven't seen for a long time. Supergirl, as she showed up after Crisis on Infinite Earths, has routinely been shown as either equal to Superman in power or less powerful. But this story begins to hint at the idea that she may be more capable than he is because she goes toe-to-toe against Cyborg Superman, and that's not an easy feat. Remember, Cyborg is the most powerful of all the versions of these characters that exist right now, but at the end of the day, none of it really seems to matter because of the fact that General Zod and the villains managed to get their hands on the Phantom Zone projector. Now remember, the Phantom Zone projector is basically another means of transporting people to the Phantom Zone. It exists for the purpose, it's like this portable device of just teleporting them away. Once the Superman family shows up with the intention of trying to continue this fight, General Zod grabs a projector and just teleports them into the Phantom Zone. And again, it's kind of a cool moment because what this does is begin setting the stage for the possibility that Mr. Oz is effectively Superman. Now, the way this initially picks up is with Superman actually gaining his eyesight back. Now, we're not really given a definitive explanation for why this is. We're just kind of told to accept it, that that's just the way it is. But what ends up happening here is, of course, with a couple other people people transported alongside Superman in the form of Eradicator and Cyborg. The remaining battle outside really sees General Zod taking out Mongol, intending to take out Supergirl, but then we also end up having Jonathan Kent don this Kryptonian battlesuit. Now again, this Kryptonian battlesuit was the suit that was used by Superman to previously heal himself. The problem with this is that his injuries were so extreme, it effectively burned out the healing capabilities of the battlesuit, which is the reason why they didn't use it to give his eyesight back. But the suit is designed for conflict, and it's designed to face off against powerful Kryptonians. With Jonathan Kent at the helm of this thing, he's able to face off against General Zod. But in the middle of all this, he begins to sort of panic, he begins to worry, and a disembodied voice, Mr. Oz, begins to chime in, basically telling him, "You're not alone, I will guide you. I'm very familiar with this suit. Everything will be okay." And it's these small things, these small little tidbits that begin to hint at the idea of who Mr. Oz is. Now, we won't definitively know until we get to like Doomsday Clock and that whole great big huge story arc, but it's the small things that are being said. The armor will protect you until help arrives. I know how this armor works. You know, the idea that Mr. Oz is looking out for Jonathan Kent and looking out for Superman. And so what this does is it brings in the nature of this theory. Now, this is not a theory that I thought up, although I kind of wish I had. This is a theory that was actually thrown onto the DC Comics subreddit by a guy named Martin Cassis. At least I think that's how you do it, but or how you pronounce it. But the link will be down in the description so you can go check it out. But it's actually really cool because the theory of Martin Cassis is that Mr. Oz is Superman, but he's a Superman that you've never heard of. If you have heard of him, you're one of the very few that have. 99.99999% of people have never heard of this version of Superman. This is the original Superman. Contrary to what you might think, where the Superman that we're reading about right now debuted in Action Comics #1 in 1938, that's not the first Superman. The very first Superman was actually a guy named Bill Dunn, I think his name was, and he was given his powers by a guy named Ernst, who was basically just this crazy, mad scientist. Ernst Smalley, I think his name was. But this story was in a 5-issue run that was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster back when they were in high school that was called Science Fiction, The Advanced Guard of Future Civilization. Now, the idea here was that Bill Dunn was basically given powers of telepathy, but the powers were temporary. They were designed to be that way because Ernst wanted to be able to test his formula on someone to see whether or not it would actually work. Now, of course, this led to, Bill Dunn being a bad guy and trying to take over the world, but because the powers were temporary, he effectively lost them. But notice this, the powers of Bill Dunn included telepathy. They included things like cosmic awareness, knowing everything that's going on. The powers of Bill Dunn included the ability to basically work with other people or manipulate other people. Now, it's entirely possible that this is not true, but remember, with the character of this original Superman, DC's got virtually a blank slate. I mean, they can do anything they want to with this guy, but the original Superman was bald. He was a white guy. He fits all the characteristics of Mr. Oz. Mr. Oz saying things like, "I'm familiar with this suit. I'm familiar with Kryptonians. I know what Supermen are about. I know everything about you guys." It fits in. Now, some of it may also be wishful thinking, right? I mean, it may be like a lot of comic fans do, where we just kind of rearrange the pieces to make them fit the way we want to. But again, I'm kind of curious what your all's thought is about him being a version of Superman, or at least the original, very first Superman. Of course, this also asks the question, where did he come from? How did he come back? Has he been there the entire time? Because remember, Mr. Oz knows everything about Superman, everything about his life before the New 52, presumably before Crisis on Infinite Earths. Mr. Oz knows it all. Jumping back to this story and dealing with the idea of the Phantom Zone, we ultimately end up dealing with Superman coming to the realization that Ursa is actually alive. Now, this is kind of an interesting scenario because what this does is it feeds on the concept of Superman Last Son to a degree. For those of you guys who are not familiar, Ursa is the wife of General Zod and the mother of Lord Zod. But here's the biggest issue here. DC seems to be grabbing the character of Lord Zod, the son of General Zod, and then just kind of rebooting him. And the reason why I say that is because Lord Zod's really big moment, really kind of like the introduction to his character in DC Comics, came with Superman Last Son, a story that was written by Jeff Johns. And the idea here was that at some point a kid just crash landed in Metropolis, and Superman basically adopted this kid, named him Christopher, and this kid effectively had all the powers of a Kryptonian. Now, this of course led to the return of General Zod, the character of Ursa, so on and so forth. The idea that they were basically trying to reestablish, Krypton more or less, and eventually it led to Lord Zod becoming a good guy and then actually turn-coding against his parents and flying back into the Phantom Zone in order to close the portal and, contain General Zod and his forces once again. But while Christopher did return, while Lord Zod did end up coming back, effectively he was a good guy. He rebuked the entire history of his parents. In this scenario, it does not seem to play out the same way. Instead, what seems to basically happen here, much like what had happened in the original Superman The Last Son storyline, Lord Zod was born from Ursa and General Zod while they were in the Phantom Zone. The difference here is that he never escaped. He never came back. He's just always been there. And so the idea here is that he, alongside his mother, are basically the reason why General Zod's done everything that he's been doing. We're basically told that from the time General Zod first popped out in Suicide Squad Rebirth, his singular goal has always been to get his family back. He doesn't care about the armies of Krypton. He doesn't care about all those lost souls that are out there in the Phantom Zone. All he wants is to get his family back. And it's one of the coolest things because it humanizes his character. Like Superman has his family. He's got Lois Lane, he's got Jonathan Kent. General Zod is not that far off. They're basically like a mirror image of Superman as we know him. And so it's really kind of like this cool moment where these characters stand side by side but represent two starkly different things. Now, of course, once we end up finding out that this was the motivation behind General Zod, ultimately we end up having this Phantom Zone projector opened once again that allows Superman to grab Eradicator, and ultimately Eradicator escapes alongside General Zod. But what ends up taking place is that the rest of the Superman family end up closing off the Phantom Zone with Cyborg Superman trapped inside. Now, this does not mean he dies. It doesn't mean that he's gone. What this is DC doing is actually putting him on the back burner. At some point along the line, he could escape the Phantom Zone and suddenly Cyborg Superman's back. One of the worst things that a comic book publisher can do is kill a superhero or a supervillain. And the reason why is because of the fact that while comic books do have a measure of suspension of disbelief, there also has to be some measure of propriety, some measure of continuity that comes into play with individual characters. A really good point is the character of Colossus. Colossus died in the 1990s when he basically sacrificed his life to cure the legacy virus, this virus just racking up a death toll of millions of lives. But the fact that Colossus came back during Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men basically cheapened the fact that he had died in the first place. It was the same thing with Superman himself. Superman sacrificed his life to save the world in a battle against Doomsday. And then suddenly, well, he was just in a Kryptonian healing matrix. It cheapens his death. It takes away from how significant that death was. And what seems to be going on here is DC is effectively kind of shying away from this idea of just killing off supervillains left and right, and instead throwing them into some place where they can't escape on their own, and somebody will let them out later on down the line, whether they mean to or whether it's accidental. So it's a pretty intelligent way of going through and figuring out a way to deal with Cyborg Superman. But again, the real big talk about this whole video is the nature, the character of Mr. Oz. Mr. Oz going through and racking up these various superheroes, putting them in stasis, keeping them hidden. It begs the question of who he is. Now, my money is still on the fact that this is classic Lex Luthor. That's my money here. The fact that he says, well, I know how this suit works, that's not specific to the original Superman. Anybody who encountered it, anybody who ever piloted it, anybody intelligent enough to figure out how it works, but it does raise the question, with all the histories that are out there of these individual characters that people are speculating for the identity of Mr. Oz, is it possible to navigate those waters and to juggle those blocks around and to sort of shift things up in a way to make them fit this mold? Or is it easier to just take a character that virtually no one's ever heard of, bring him back, make him a clean slate, and then introduce him as somebody else? We don't have the answer to that question. We don't really know what's going on. At this point, it's simply just a theory on who he is. But what this story ends up doing is it actually ends up basically bringing to fruition the idea that General Zod is going to try to raise his own monarchy, so to speak, that the age of General Zod has begun when he's standing alongside his wife, his son, as well as the Eradicator, with the intention of trying to restore Krypton, effectively bringing back this new Krypton storyline, more or less, from before the New 52. But, again, it's really a cool story. It's pretty interesting in terms of how all this unfolds and how it all comes together. But I'm curious, let me know if you think, what you think about that theory down in the comments section, and make sure you guys check out that guy's Reddit post, because it's something like 2 weeks old. It's really not that old. It's still pretty new. And at this point, it's really the most popular theory on Reddit with regards to who Mr. Oz's identity is. But anyway, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.